Welcome to Windows on the World. Hopefully this is third time lucky, and we now have Piers Corbyn next to us. We've actually started this show twice, and I'm actually going to have to get on windowsontheworld.net again because we're live from a festival. But Piers, you've been having a debate. Can you tell us about that debate, please?
Yes, we had a debate here with Professor Richard Betts from the University of Exeter about man-made climate change, and this debate follows the appearance of me and Mark and Sandy, or various combinations of us, first of all at the Harlequin Festival, and then secondly at the Sunrise Festival. And at both of those we've had very considerable support for our view that the man-made climate change theory driven by man-made carbon dioxide is nonsense and false, and that actually it's propagated for a deeper agenda, namely to regiment people into believing all sorts of other things, like involving Agenda 21, and also it's to increase profits of the oil companies. Anyway, at this festival, which is the rebel tent of the Beautiful Days Festival, we actually had a debate. I mean, there wasn't really long enough for a full debate, but we did nevertheless have quite a good debate involving Professor Richard Betts and myself. And the first thing to notice, of course, is that we had a record attendance at this tent, and Glenn, the organiser, said it was down to us turning up to talk about man-made climate change. Although I should also add, I think it was also partly to do with Richard Betts bringing along a large number of his students to support him. That's what a number of people have pointed out to me. But nevertheless, it was a good, very good showing at this rebel tent. And I went in there into some detail as to why the CO2 theory fails. I went into to show how actually that if you have a extra piece of CO2 in the atmosphere, then it will not actually get warmer than the rest of the atmosphere. It'll warm up quicker, but it will also cool down quicker later, and the extra CO2 bits of atmosphere will reach the same temperature as the lower CO2 bits of atmosphere, as long as you wait long enough, which isn't very long anyway. So that's why the CO2 theory as put forward by the BBC doesn't work. And there's also other versions of it which I explained and showed are untrue. And I also put the argument that just the factual observations that CO2 levels follow world temperatures, and that is accepted across the board, and that if CO2 is actually controlling temperatures, then if man has to control temperatures, then it means man's CO2 has to be followed by nature's CO2, and man is only doing 1/25 of the CO2 product in and out of the biosphere. So the CO2 theory of climate requires a conspiracy of nature, which is a nonsense. And there was a couple of other things I put forward too. And Richard Betts answered none of these. He did concede that CO2 levels generally follow temperatures, but then said, but then there's more CO2 and that increases temperatures. But you see, this is completely a supposition. He had no evidence of that. No evidence, because the experiment, as I mentioned, about putting a CO2 object in front of another object, it's not going to cause actual warming. So he didn't answer that. He didn't answer where's the conspiracy of nature. Neither did he answer that the proposition of the man-made climate change theory is that the jet stream should move northwards, so that the area north of the jet stream, the colder area, is smaller. And it hasn't done that in the last 5 or 10 years. It's moved southwards and gone very wild. So he didn't answer any of those things. And we had a debate about all sorts of stuff, you know. Some people saying that I was an agent of the oil companies, and I pointed out, well, actually the oil companies support the man-made climate change theory because it enables them to up oil prices, and that is a fact, and the oil companies themselves say they support
yes,
the
but the thing with that, it was numerous kind of allegations thrown in, wasn't it?
Yes, there were.
She actually said, when are we going to stop bombing children in Yemen? Well, we were talking about climate change.
I know.
And she threw in everything as though everything
One
bad in the
person
world
did, yeah.
was on one side and everything good on the world was on the other side, and you were on the side of bad for some reason. It was a very childlike and stupid response, but unfortunately it was quite a typical response from what they call millennials, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think that's a fair comment, that was. But nevertheless, the actual results of the voting was, he brought all of his students to vote for him, that's fair enough. Well, not fair enough, but that's just as it is. However, we did a measure of people who changed their minds, and about in the audience or so of 100 people, 6 people definitely changed their minds, and probably there was only half a dozen or 10 or so before. So basically I doubled or almost doubled support, and had what would be described as a 6% swing to Corbyn, i.e. this Corbyn, at the meeting. Now that is actually an incredible showing, you know, so too, and people afterwards said to me, Piers, that was amazing. And you know, I met a number of the people who had changed their minds, and they were really very interested in following things seriously. And I also had a question from somebody who, I'm not sure if he changed his mind or not, but he was, I don't think he had, he just didn't know. He now was in a position he didn't know. And he said, well, where do we take all this then? Because there's a lot of information there. Where do we take it from here? And I think that is a really important question for everyone at the show, speak, and anyone listening here. That we understand now that the climate change theory is used to corral and regiment people and justify corporates making super profits. So, okay, we know that, but then we have to focus into, well, what are we going to do? What are the issues we can grab on which are really important for the globalist Wall Street agenda, which we want to stop? And at the Sunrise, we came up with the point that the dealing with 5G is very important, because the 5G introduction, apart from being dangerous, you know, and causing ill health, is also part of the, you know, reducing wages, Internet of Things and so on, which is more and more about control. So
the thing is, Piers,
that we need to actually
those
address.
sort of people are going to find all this hard to put together, because they lump it's kind of weird, because they lump everything in together when they want to.
A raft of
Everything
ideology
bad,
goes
a raft
together,
of ideology, a corridor of opinion is allowed, but when you point out the bigger picture of it, it actually blows their minds. They can't see generally how it's all connected. But that's really interesting. So that girl put everything into one box she didn't like, including people who are climate change deniers. But when it's the other way round and they're shown a load of things that are interconnected, they can't seem to grasp it.
They can't process it at all.
No, that's absolutely true and very important. And Glenn here, who's in charge of this Rebel Tent, he said it was a fantastic debate, and he wants me here next year for a full hour to go into proper stuff. Great. And I'm sure he'd want, you know, because I mentioned you in the debate anyway, he'd want you and Sandy along, Mark, to talk about the bigger picture. And there's other aspects of true green versus fake green that I didn't have time to talk about. Like one is, which it's a fact, and this is from World Health Organization, that 12 million people a year, 12 million, which is 2 Holocausts if you want these numbers waved around, 12 million people a year die from fuel poverty in the world. 12 million. And the fuel poverty is mostly caused, I would say, by man-made climate change policies, holding up energy prices because they believe that energy consumption is bad and so forth, and they're holding back the development of Africa and so forth. Now, that is a big death number. Even if it's a quarter of that, you know, 4 million, 3 million, whatever, that's a huge number of people dying as a consequence of man-made climate change policies. And these millennials, as you put them, I mean, don't want to be disparaging because it isn't, you know, but young people in Momentum and the like, a lot more and more of whom do support what we have to say, but they've got to take the message out that, you know, it can't be right to have a worldwide policy change which is killing either, you know, 3, 4, 5 or 12 people a year.
It's very difficult because they've been programmed in their education system.
Yes.
And for them to actually pull that apart is very difficult. They've got really attached to those ideals and those ideologies.
Yeah.
So it's going to take quite a while for them to just let go of them. They will, but I think, as you said, the tide is turning.
Sure, the tide is turning. Look, if Labour got a 6% swing anywhere, that would be fantastic. And if they double a Labour vote in a weak place, that is incredible. Because I was a Labour organiser at one point, and if we did that, we'd be dancing, right? And of course, Richard Betts has to take away from this that his theory is losing. Now he said, oh, we'll have another debate in 5 years, but Glenn here wants us to come back in a year's time and do a full debate. Well, he can have 2 debates. We could do a presentation in an hour and talk about the bigger picture, of science and why the CO2 theory is used, and he can have another presentation if he wants on what's going on in standard climate science.
Just looking at some of the comments now we're back on.
Okay.
Of course, it would have been great to have our listeners in that tent because they could have asked some questions. I got a bit kind of discouraged with it in a way. I'll tell you why.
In the questions, you mean?
Well, I was going to pipe up about the IPCC reports, which in actual fact should have been brought up, and I would suggest, if I could, that you make a note of that, Piers, because the AL4 and AL5 documents are wildly wrong.
Yeah.
And any layperson can read that, and that's what that guy was depending on. He was depending on that, and was he also a contributor to the IPCC?
He was,
Yes.
He's on the committee. Now, I've got friends on these committees who've been frozen out, and they've had their publications ignored and refused to put on, and they've been not allowed to leave the IPCC because they want to use their names against themselves. There's been big struggles in the past in the IPCC. It's a thief's kitchen, in my opinion. If I can get something in there, then that's fine. But this idea that those people who don't agree with man-made climate change somehow don't have qualified papers is completely untrue.
Absolutely.
But I think you needed to make more of that because he kind of won on a false premise there. I thought, because he came across and he was very smarmy, in my opinion, because what he was doing was he was trying to undermine you by taking the upper hand. In other words, you were a bit of a crank, and he had all the information, and he spent ages reeling off his qualifications, which was incredibly boring to the rest of us, but he loved it, didn't he?
Well, I got loads of qualifications, but I didn't have time to reel them off.
Well, exactly.
Because we have people have to focus on the questions, which they did. Because a lot of people afterwards are really pleased. They said, look, okay, one woman said this has blown her mind, actually. Amazing. In our favour. And another one, others were saying, a man who was saying, well, this, I don't know where we're going now, but this is really important. So, we are opening up doors, Mark, and this is the way it has to be done. But guys listening out there have to take this forward in their communities and groups and so forth.
Yes, guys, everyone in chat, if these people had been there, we could have got some more questions in, I think, more interesting and balanced questions. But in actual fact, some of the questions and the points made were quite fair enough, weren't they, really? It wasn't really biased in that respect. It was just that it was steered in a direction towards him, and also the fellow who's doing your slideshow, the technician, sided with him, which he shouldn't have done.
No, I didn't see what business of it is his.
He suddenly popped in about numbers of published papers. Well, hang on, because as I said, I didn't.
But if those published papers are flawed, then what's the point?
Yeah, exactly. Well, they are flawed.
Yeah, they are exactly.
Well, they are, and basically they're papers which mention man-made climate change but don't prove anything.
Yeah.
They're like lists of observations. Well, okay, you can list observations and say, I'm a Roman Catholic. Well, okay, but the observations don't prove that being a Roman Catholic is correct.
Well, this was, I think, a very important thing to learn from that debate, because if you had some referenced papers,
which I do have, they were in the list at the start, which we skipped over because we didn't have time.
Exactly, but they were skipped over. But those needed.
But they'll be on the website.
That's not the issue. If that had been filmed, he won. That's the point. He won. He won in front of the audience.
Yeah.
And he did it. He wasn't being devious, but he took the higher ground. He took the moral high ground as well, with the way he was. I did say something to him. The point is that that should have been part of the presentation, in my opinion. That for next time, if you debate like that, have those references, because if you've got references, papers that you can bring up from people like Niels Axel Morner, etc., and lots of other people. Yeah. Well, you can say you've got loads of them, but that doesn't mean anything to the audience. It doesn't mean anything, but they hear that scientists agree, and well, 90% of scientists agree, 97% of scientists agree, and they hear these things tripping off the tongue of these academics. That's where their power is. So that is where I think you have to get them as well. So you can come up with the alternative theory, but I think that really helps, because when I've spoken to people about this, I've quoted some of this stuff, especially the IPCC, and I said, have you read the AR5 document? And they say no. I said, well, you can't comment on it then, because none of it's come true, and none of it's likely to come true, and it's wildly out. So why is it wildly out? What are they trying to do by skewing data? And then you can go into why, which brings us on to what we were talking about last night in that tent. I had to kind of rush through my presentation because we got there a bit late, and I didn't go into the bigger reasons behind what's going on. I went more into what is going on and how it's being engineered. And then Sandy took over for Agenda 21, and Piers did his talk on the CO2 and the climate change agenda. So
which is at the Sunrise Festival.
That's at the Sunrise Festival. That was on Saturday night. And the thing about that was it was pretty well attended, considering it was a Saturday night, because we were warned that there might not be many people there. And in actual fact, I was feeling quite apathetic about it. And when we walked in the tent, I was quite pleasantly surprised actually that there was people in there, and because none of it was advertised, was it? I mean, there's not like these banners up everywhere that we're doing anything. People have to actually find it and read in tiny writing what it says on a leaflet on the door, you know. Okay, so moving on, let's have a look into chat and see what's happening in chat. Martin makes waste policy simple. Flammables in all plastics go to incinerator. I think we've come in halfway through the conversation. It's quite interesting actually, because the conversation in chat doesn't always reflect what we're talking about, which makes it multi-layered. Martin says, here on the Isle of Man, a lot of our energy comes from a waste to energy plant. Never anything nasty seen coming out of its chimney. I go past it every day. What have you got to say about that, Piers?
Well, that is good. When I was a councillor in 1986 to 1990, I was in charge of setting up a combined heat and power station, which was burning waste and producing electricity on the Suffolk-Lewisham boundary, which was we had this consortium board set up to make it happen, and it did happen, and that is going on. So I'm all for burning waste plastic and so forth, as long as you can clean the products that come out of the chimney.
Another thing that
guys noticing it can be done.
Another thing that came on tonight was about green energy, and one fella stood up and started talking about solar panels, saying everybody should have solar panels. Now, most people seem to have solar panels these days anyway. If you go past most houses, you know, if you get out of London, most houses do seem to have solar panels on now. What have you got to say about that?
Well, they're only there because there's a subsidised game, and actually the people living in flats in London and other cities are paying for the solar panels. So the Guardian readers who've got houses have been paid for by working class readers, well, who probably don't read anything, or don't read the Guardian anyway, might read the Daily Mirror. They're subsidising those who've got houses, and you know, the costs involved are that actually solar power is more expensive than coal power to make electricity, and coal power can be made clean by removing the particles. I think in the future solar power will be genuinely cheaper, but at present it's not. I mean, if you want to have a solar panel, then fine, but bear in mind, you know, the materials used to make it do come from, you know, very oppressive mining conditions in Africa, and you're only been able to, it's only worth its production due to a subsidy, and I think the subsidy is an incorrect way of going forward.
Okay, so Eric von
to
Essex
make it cheaper.
Says, I know people that are being ripped off and paying more for their electricity since having solar panels. Now this is to do with the tariff they're on, I suppose, is it? Because some of my relatives have got them and they think it's a good idea. Now I know they're not greatly, brilliantly efficient, but they do actually do something. I mean, can you actually go into how effective solar panels are? Because it's something I've never really looked at, to be honest.
Well, it's an expensive way of producing electricity, and they deteriorate in quality over the years. They get dirty. And
but you have to clean them, yeah.
Yes, you do. And they're installed over large areas of land as well, where they're just taking farmland out of use, which is a bad thing. So, I mean, I don't think they are the way forward. If you want to have one, then do it, but bear in mind that you are actually being subsidised by somebody else, and if the subsidy disappeared, you would find it wasn't worth it under current technology. 10 years time it might be that solar will become actually cheaper, but right now it's not. In my opinion, these alternative energy schemes ought to be treated as experimental until such time as they, if ever, they can become cheaper than other things, as long as the other things can be clean, and coal can be clean, i.e. you can remove all the soot at source, which is a lot better than having smaller scale locally produced power, generally speaking. But centralised coal-fired power stations are the cheapest way of producing electricity.
Eric says solar panels give you electricity when you don't want it and give you sod all when you do want it, which is actually a really, really good point, isn't it?
It is, because they
now
have
that
to
much
be,
I do know.
They've got to be backed up by coal-fired power stations when they're not working. So the advent of the solar panels means a bigger fluctuation in the flow levels, electrical flow in the networks, and it means a ramping up and down of oil or coal-fired power stations.
Okay,
which can make them more inefficient at times. But you know, that is a consequence of it, and people ought to know that when they're doing it.
Tartary says, I lived off grid for 8 years in the forest and had 160 watt solar. The batteries are the weak link. Now this is an important point, isn't it? Because I'm thinking of getting solar panels for the top of my van, and I'm just sort of looking into that. And yeah, they are good for living off grid though, aren't they, Piers?
Well, they are, yeah. If you would have to live off grid, a solar panel or a wind farm, or well, a little windmill will help. But you know, you're going to have times when you've got a problem, and that requires batteries. Now, once you bring batteries in, you reach huge inefficiencies. Basically, the charging and discharging of a battery, you're going to lose half the energy, or even 75% of the energy if you do it as rapidly as possible. And that is just very straightforward electrical engineering physics, which means it's going to be costly. You've got to buy the batteries too, which is costly. If you stick them in a van, you're going to have to carry them around, which is also going to use up more petrol. So you can't rely on them, you've got to have backup.
Yeah, quite a good point there. I mean, we did go to that green energy conference, and we found that most of the green energy is produced by diesel generators.
The backups are, yes. What they have, these companies are now all over alternative energy in the world is only a few percent, you know, 2% or 5% depending how you measure it. And most of the rest is either coal or oil, and next down is nuclear.
And is it true, Piers, that most renewables are actually more costly to actually generate?
Yes, they are. Yeah. They are. The all renewables actually, I would say, are more costly than what can be clean coal-fired power, and they also have large carbon footprints, despite their publicity. But the carbon footprint of an electric vehicle is much bigger than a petrol vehicle, because because of the huge amount of carbon dioxide produced in order to make the batteries, which are colossal things in those vehicles. Colossal things, like they're weighing about 3 or 4 people. So you've got a car which has already got 3 or 4 people in it to drive around.
Now let's get back to the science, the so-called science or the consensus science, because this professor talked quite a lot about the greenhouse effect and the atmosphere. Now, can you go into that a bit, because he was saying that this has already been proven and that the heat is kept in by the atmosphere?
Well, it's nonsense what he says, and he didn't answer the details that I put forward. I showed that if he's using the kind of BBC school argument, which actually climate scientists that don't study this properly don't accept anyway, but he's using it as a Mickey Mouse projection. So well, the idea is that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will absorb radiation from the ground and then send it back to the earth, and that makes the earth warmer. Right, so just by standing in front of the audience, we had 2 people, me pretending to be carbon dioxide, extra carbon dioxide, and one bloke who was normal air. So, and we had somebody who was pretending to be the ground, and we started off being cold, so we'd have the radiation from this ground and it would warm us up, and I would warm up quicker because I'm a better absorber of infrared radiation. And this is all that the Tyndall experiment showed in Victorian times, that a greenhouse gas, as they called it later, would absorb infrared quicker, and it will also emit infrared quicker. So when you turned off the warm ground and put ice on it, say, the CO2 would cool quicker than the ordinary air, but both of them after a long period of time would reach exactly the same temperature as the ground beneath. So they reach the same temperature as the ground beneath, and then they're radiated into the sky exactly the same as was radiated before by the ground itself. In other words, the CO2 can have no effect whatsoever in the temperature of the atmosphere. It just doesn't work. And if it did work and was actually warmed up, you could then have a perpetual motion machine, because you could have a bit of CO2 atmosphere that gets extra warm and a bit of ordinary atmosphere that stays at the ground level. Well, okay, so now you've got a piece of atmosphere that's warmed up beyond ground level. So you've got heat flowing uphill, which is against the laws of thermodynamics. It's a complete, utter nonsense. And the people who put it forward know it's a nonsense. But, you know, it'll do for children, as they say. Now, the proper argument is the one that the temperature of the atmosphere decreases with height, and radiation from the atmosphere can only be lost at the top of the atmosphere, where there's not much greenhouse gas or dust particles or anything above it. And that means that if you have more CO2, that radiation level, the height of it, goes up higher. And then when you go down in the atmosphere, you get warmer and warmer because of compression of gas. So that makes the surface warmer. So that theory works, but I pointed out that there's flaws with that. One is that the extra CO2 makes plants grow faster and therefore transpire more and cool the ground more, and that is accepted as being a fact. The actual amount can be argued about, but it's accepted as a fact. The second thing is, I pointed out why their theory doesn't work, and their theory requires a hot spot over the equator, compared with in 2010 they'd say there had to be one compared with 2000. A hot spot over the equator due to the extra CO2 in the atmosphere keeping it warmer up there, right? I said, well, actually, with the radiation going up and down as the 4th power of temperature, the day-night fluctuations of temperature will mean that there's actually extra radiation coming out from the top of the atmosphere when there's more CO2, because the range of temperatures will be bigger. So the 4th power of the mean is going to be less than the 4th power of the upper and the lower averaged, you see. So if you have 1 and 2 and 3, the mean is 2, and 2 to the 4th is 16, but the average of 1 to the 4th and 3 to the 4th is going to be 82 divided by 2 is 42. So you see, the 4th power of the of a wide range is going to be bigger than the 4th power of the ring. So that means extra CO2 should make a cooling. Now that is actually observed. There is not a hotspot above the equator in the data. After 10 years of observations, there's actually a cold spot. So the whole theory fails at every level.
Another thing that he accused you of was dealing in half facts, and that was something he kept bringing up.
But he was dealing in no facts or also half facts.
Well, we're talking about how it came across to the audience, you see, because if that had been, if I didn't know what I know, and I was looking at purely as a scientific thing, and I didn't know anything about it, because of his performance and the way he took it, if I didn't know anything about what he was doing, as I'm talking about if I was a member of the public, in there,
right,
it would appear that he won on most points to me, because what you did opened it very well, but in my opinion, you went in a little bit hard at the beginning, because you were saying, oh, this is rubbish and that's rubbish, and that's fine if you're a bit, do you know what I mean, if you're already in there a bit. But because a lot of them were completely naive, I think that may have gone against you a bit, because it was he came across, well, he was an academic, wasn't he? But
yeah,
the point is that I could see through what he was doing. But what I'm trying to get at here is the strategy, is that there might be a better strategy to actually bring this out. And yeah, I think referring to these documents, and also sea levels, that was an important part of it, and I thought that could have been a stronger point actually that you could have made. I don't know whether you agree with that, because he did go into sea levels quite a bit.
Yeah.
And somebody else brought it up.
We didn't have time, but the sea level argument doesn't support his case at all.
Well, that's okay, but they don't know that, you see.
No.
The point is
but
that
he just talked vaguely about sea levels and moved on.
Well, the compare brought it up and said we should all move away from the coast, didn't
he? Yeah, he did. I mean, you could have mentioned that whole thing about that seaside town in
Fairbairn. Yes.
Fairbairn.
Yes, exactly. That was the whole point. You see, what I'm trying to get at here is to strengthen it a bit, because if you'd have brought that up, that Niels Axel Morner said they have nothing to worry about, and this is a depopulation of coastal areas. In other words, they're trying to get people away from small villages because it's part of a bigger agenda to get people to live in cities. You wouldn't even have to go into it that much. But if you could mention that, for instance, when we talked at that climate conference at Conway Hall, Christopher Monckton actually said he knew people at Lloyd's who would underwrite these properties that are now going to become uninsurable. Now, this would have been very powerful. You see what I mean? These are really powerful points to say. No, they don't. It's not about the time. It's about being able to fight back on their points, but to a lay audience. Do you see what I'm getting?
Yeah, I do.
think if I'd have heard, well, I would have. You could put that in. You see, because these people are going to bring it up. So you could maybe put the science in and the theories, and then bring this in. Because when I've mentioned that to people, they go, "Really? So Lloyd's of London, they are not going to insure anything that's going to get flooded, right? Because they're there to make lots of money."
Yeah.
So, in other words, if they'll insure those properties, Lloyd's of London know that they're not going to.
No, that's good. No, I didn't know that.
Right,
you're talking about, but you could have hopped in with that. I mean, there's loads of facts around which they're unknown. They're known unknowns to me, or unknown knowns.
Yeah, and maybe we should have been more vocal. I mean, you can explain it far more than me because you were at that conference. But yeah, I just remembered the seaside town where Lloyd's Lloyd's were insuring them. And,
well, we did a show on it. I mean, the thing is that this stuff I think is very powerful.
Were the insurance rates higher, as a matter of interest?
Well, he said they would underwrite them. That's all he said. We didn't go into individual costings or anything like that.
Given they're claiming they're going to be flooded. But see, I pointed out at various meetings, Al Gore hasn't moved away from the sea.
Of course not.
So he knows it's not true anyway.
I'm curious, what happened to the hole in the ozone? Asks Eric von Essex. Do you know what happened to the hole in the ozone? Did it repair itself?
Well, these holes in the ozone go up and down. There was a decrease in ozone holes, yes, Was it because of stopping CFCs in refrigerators? We don't actually know, because there always have been holes in the ozone layer because of undersea volcanoes which force bromine and fluorine compounds into the atmosphere, and those are the crucial things to make ozone holes over the Antarctic, where you've got to have a super cold droplets with these halogen compounds on them, which then destroy ozone. But you've got to have, it's something that's can only happen when it's very, very cold, the very, very cold, super cold water droplets in the Antarctic. We haven't heard much about the ozone hole, no, that is true. But it's not really anything to do with global warming either, although the people promoting global warming do pop in with it, you know, as a kind of irrelevant hang-on. But Richard Betts didn't talk about ozone, or I don't recall it if he did.
No, it didn't, and CFCs have gone pretty quiet as well, haven't they?
I think a thing to note, though, is that the supposed root cause of the Grenfell Tower fire was a refrigerator which had flammable refrigerant in it. If it still had a CFC in it, it wouldn't have caught fire.
Well, that's a very good point, and something we haven't got time to go into. We did a show about Grenfell, the Grenfell agenda, and it turned out pretty much as expected. In other words, the gatekeepers turned up, and the community leaders, who weren't really community leaders, and the people turned up who were the change agents in there to make them look ridiculous, and they split the group up, which is what always happens. And that's what we were talking about last night. But before we get onto that, something very amusing from Eric von Essex. He says, I noticed that with the decline in the ozone, there's been a rise in homosexuality. Is there a link? So is the LBGT, is that due to the decrease in the ozone layer?
Right, or it might have been, it's also gone up with with increased global warming propaganda. And these things come from the same groups, actually.
Yeah.
Well, it is. It's a good link, that, because it takes us into propaganda and what I wanted to talk about next. And that was something we talked about a lot last night. And I think that the debates where you go into the propaganda behind things are actually more effective than these ones, because the public are fed this stuff. And once they hear Royal Society and academia and say, well, why would they be lying?
Yeah.
This is the big problem, isn't it? Whereas if you take it down to things like we're talking about the Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, is this happening near you? Do you know why it's happening? Have you got a choice in the matter? No. All our choice has been taken away. It's going on everywhere. That's quite powerful.
Do you agree that, well, okay, I can list stuff and say X, Y, Z are published, but frankly, I was there to give people convincing arguments, scientific arguments, why their theory was wrong. And people were coming up to me afterwards, lots of people, who either had almost switched and didn't know anymore, i.e. they'd been convinced by the science, and those who had been totally convinced and switched over. And that is the important thing. We have to get to the actual root of the issue, and move beyond the academics gaming, which is, you know, you shove, oh, the consensus is, you see, that is their game. And we have to say, as I pointed out near the start, look here, your point of view was used by the Spanish Inquisition against Galileo. Now everybody applauded that fact, right? And really that is the root of the issue we've got here, is that consensus, and this covers everything, consensus doesn't mean truth. Consensus is used to control, and advance of knowledge involves breaking consensus.
Well, yes, the point I think I was trying to make here is that I was looking at that as though it was a televised debate, you see, and because I'm editing it in my head, I knew what they would have done to undermine you. Maybe I should have made that point to start with. I was actually seeing it as a sort of televised thing.
But it didn't work from their point of view, because he didn't convince anybody. He didn't switch anybody.
No, that's absolutely, that is a major point. That he didn't convince anybody who wasn't already on his side.
Yeah.
No, and you convinced people who would have been against it. Do we know that they were against what you thought? We don't.
Well, they said so.
Did they say so?
Yeah, I
right,
met them afterwards.
Right. Okay, we didn't know that.
This woman rushed up to me down yellow, said, "Piers, that was amazing. You convinced me. It's blown my mind," she said. And other people had come and got their addresses as well. You know, they said that was fantastic. And the ones who weren't quite sure but were turned off the climate change thing, not necessarily all the way, but were off, said, "Look, there's a lot of stuff in there, and I want to find out more." So that talk is going to be on the Rebel Tent website and on our Weather Action website.
Okay, so that's the Beautiful Days website.
That's right. Yep.
Beautiful Days is the name of the.
And I've already been invited to give a comment onto the Facebook and some links. And for those people who wanted scientific papers, like from Niels Axel Morner about sea level rise, although we didn't have much discussion on sea level rise, but he's nevertheless there's excellent papers on the matter showing that sea level has not been rising at any greater rate than it did before the well,
it's it's just a white glow now. You very rarely see the sun as a yellow.
Well, is there a difference on the emissions? Well, we are in a period of lower solar activity, so there is a difference on emissions, yes. Whether that would affect your perceived colour that much, I'm not sure. The other thing is about pollutants in the atmosphere. You see, there is less smoke pollution around now than there was then, and I think smoke would make it sort of slightly yellower, slightly redder. So it might be just that. I would suspect it's largely if you're sure about your perception. I mean,
maybe it's just a child.
Perceptions are difficult because a lot of people believe that all summers were great when they were kids and all winters were cold. Well, that's largely because they remember.
Then the pollution would have made the sun.
I think so. It would do.
Yeah.
It would do. I think it's that is what you're noticing.
Okay.
That's great. We just reconnected there.
So we can answer all the questions you have here. What's more in the chat box, Mark?
Well, we can have a look. I think people tend to make comments in our chat box more than ask questions.
Well,
really.
read some out.
Keeps cutting out, says Martin. Okay, but we're back on air now. Yes, I think we're live again. We did have a little bit of a drop out there, but yeah, that's interesting. That's probably why we haven't got any more comments. Oh yes, Jason, same problem here. Yeah, well, we're back again now, I think, because it says here that we are live. It's not reconnecting. It's all fine. So I think we've got through it quite well so far, apart from the beginning. I had to it's always the third time lucky when I do these things. It's like it's a ritual or something that I have to go through. It's very tedious. So we dropped 2 shows tonight and we're back on it now, but it's very frustrating when you start something and we lost the power completely, and we've also lost our thread slightly because we talked a lot about this. And if the public were able to sit down and listen to these variety of scientists who in some cases have worked previously for the IPCC, then they would have a much different perspective. And that climate conference that we did, actually where I met Martin Houston, one of our regular listeners and a big help to Windows on the World, Martin was filming that conference and he streamed it live, and that was a big point. I think that banned climate conference, the conference that was at Conway Hall, that was originally banned from UCL. Now the public don't know that these institutions are banning these sort of conferences, though they're banning science. And I think that's, again, would be really good to reinforce that and bring that up at these kind of debates. I mean, it would mean a lot to the public. If I heard that and I didn't know it, I would be really surprised, because if you've heard all this stuff and you believe it, then why would they be banning people talking about it then? I don't understand. Why would they? That's a good way in my opinion.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. Well, I think you guys have, you two were banned from the Green Gathering.
We were,
last year. So I think you've gained a lot of kudos for being banned, because you know, if you're banned, it means that you're saying something.
It gets a certain amount of attention. From banned
well, you know, they clearly don't want this getting out, and it's free speech. At the end of the day, you know, they're banning free speech. This is, this is a totalitarian thing to do.
Could we have gone there yesterday?
And a green gathering and come up with these patronising. They've got these patronising responses back, but that's an interesting thing, because if they'd let us speak there, if these people had any strategy, they would let us speak in a tent full of 30 people, and it would have all been forgotten about. But 6,000 or 7,000 people have seen the video on YouTube, and it's also posted elsewhere, and it's got a lot of negative comments about the green gathering on it, because people are a bit incensed about that. So that was a bit of an own goal, but it's the arrogance that you get in local authorities. Now this is a very big part of it, that this idea that you have the truth, it's like a sense of entitlement, and we've been talking about entitled people, haven't we? How people have this kind of attitude that what they know is right, and it's not based on any facts, and that is how this manipulation takes place, because that they know the public will repeat things without actually knowing them, because when it comes down to it, there's very few things that we actually know. Most of what we're talking about is theory in these cases. We can look at observed data, and we can look at the side of it which I particularly like, which is the subversion side of it, because that's where you find that they're telling lies. So if they're telling lies, they're not telling the truth. So that is, I think, the most important thing, that if something isn't true, then it's a lie, and that is very basic and very simple. And I think that is a
clear question. They gave clear answers, which were, in my opinion, incorrect answers, or nonsense arguments, or dodging the answer, dodging the question. But we thought that at least be published, but there was nothing published at all. Nothing at all. They just left a complete blank. Because they couldn't cope with the point. Now, I've spoken to some of these experts who said, well, yes, Piers, you might be right, but, you know, we've got mouths to feed and mortgages to pay, so they'll carry on.
I think that point needs to be made a lot stronger with these so-called experts as well, and with these people who we've met. I mean, the people at the climate conference. What I've noticed is that the people who are honest about the data are really nice people, and the people who are lying aren't. Now that may sound very childish, right? That may sound very, it's almost like it must be like, that sounds like a millennial kind of argument. You know, nice people tell the truth and bad people lie. Well, that's not, I mean, I don't want it quite as simple as that, but it's actually,
yes, it is that simple. Come on.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is this, and a very important point, is that the quiet voice of reason is not what the public want to hear. That's the point, and we're talking about Alex Jones, not the quiet voice of reason, not the truth. Now, the thing is that people have been talking about in chat with, I don't want to divert onto him, but the point is that people like people who shout loudly and make soundbite points, and that's the problem with a lot of these scientists. They're scientists, they're not propagandists, and they cannot understand why this is happening. People like Niels Axel-Morner, he's actually really... He's actually amazed that people are lying, because he tells the truth about what he does, and that's his trade. So his trade is telling the truth and basically looking at data and analysing that data correctly. And they can't quite understand why people are lying until they get into this agenda that we talk about. Do you see what I mean? The scientific community needs to get involved and look at what the end game is with all this, and I know some of those people are beginning to, but I think it would really help them to get things across to the public, because they would then be more vociferous, because they would realise that there isn't actually an enemy. It's not, we're not trying to find the truth here. There is an enemy out there, and they have an agenda.
And it's identifying who that enemy is, you know, because, you know, as you know, if you're trying to win a game, you have to know who your enemy is, and at the moment a lot of people don't know. And once they start joining the dots and realising what the bigger picture is with Agenda 21, 2030, and the whole thing, and the smart city agenda and the 5G agenda, you know, then, you know, people will join the dots.
I think you're right, Sandy. That's the whole idea of combining our talks. So you get 3 talks that give a broad view of what's going on, and we'll keep doing it as long as people are listening. So that's it from Windows on the World, somewhere in Devon. and we're in a dip. And
Ottery St Mary.
Ottery St Mary.
Ottery
Good
St.
night,
Mary.
Ottery St Mary. We'll see you at a secure location next week. Thanks for listening, everybody.